Having a good week, I'm going to give a bit of information on how validity, reliability, and bias all integrate with one another. These concepts are related, sometimes in a very strong way, sometimes in a very weak way, but I want you to understand when you have one thing, what does that mean about the others? So first and foremost, validity is the most important concept. If an assessment is valid, it's also going to be reliable or reliable enough and unbiased, or meaning it's going to treat people fairly and not give you systematic errors. If an assessment is not valid, it could be for multiple reasons. It could be that a type of validity is low, either content, construct, or criterion, meaning that maybe you have items on there that aren't supposed to be on there and you're out of alignment. It could be that you're assessing a bunch of other skills that you don't really want to assess, or it could be that even though things look right, it doesn't really match up with any other evidence that you get, either at the current moment or in the future. It could also be that reliability is low, or it could be that it's biased and giving you systematic errors, or it could be any combination of those things. But if it is valid, you know that all those things are good. Now, you can't really be sure what's going on without any additional investigation. Now, as to the question of how reliable is reliable enough, perfect reliability is seldom, if ever, obtained. And so we have these varying degrees, right? In this first case, this is what I would consider strong reliability. You have a small standard error, you're really close to the target every time, right? It's centered around that bullseye, so that's good. In other cases, you have a moderate level of reliability, and even though you're kind of centered around the bullseye, you're not always getting that close. And so sometimes your assessment results are really far off of what the truth is, right? And we can think of the bullseye as being the truth or the true score. And then the distance from the bullseye to any one of these marks is really the error, and then averaging all those out kind of gives you the standard error. You get to an area where you have very weak reliability. In other words, you're all over the place off the target sometimes, right? This is a case where you're going to have large standard errors, and you would say that this is not even valid because, yeah, it's kind of centered around the truth, but I never know what I'm really getting, whether I'm way high, way to the right, way to the left, way low. Anything could be happening, and I can't tell anything based on my assessment results. And so somewhere between here and here, you have to make this decision saying that this isn't good enough, that the reliability is getting so bad that it's no longer valid. You might even say, depending on what you're trying to measure, that it's somewhere between here and here, that even this could be unacceptable in some cases. But that's kind of a case-by-case thing, and you'd have to do a lot of measuring to figure out what was going on exactly. A couple other things I want to point out that'll set up our conversation for the next two slides is that sometimes you have very consistent results, but you have a very systematic error, meaning this is high and to the left, right? This is a case where my reliability is really strong, but I have a fair amount of bias, and that means my validity is poor. Likewise, I can have a less reliable result and still have the same amount of bias or more bias. And so here I would have medium reliability. Things are kind of grouped together, but I have a pretty strong bias, and again, I'm going to have poor validity. So as far as the connections then between reliability and the other two ideas, if an assessment is reliable, it means you get consistent results, and it's necessary for validity, but not sufficient, right? It's one of the things you need to have if you want something to be valid, but it's not enough because of all those other things we talked about. So reliability and validity are related in the following way. If something is reliable, it might be valid or it might not be. I can't tell, right? Because it's necessary but not sufficient. So even though this piece might be in place for validity, it might not be enough because there could be other validity or bias issues. If an assessment is not reliable, it cannot be valid. So this is one of those things where you know for sure. If I say your assessment's not reliable, you can say, well, then it's not valid, period. So that's one thing that you can know. When we talk about bias and reliability, those two things function fairly independently. If an assessment is reliable, it might be biased. If it's not reliable, it also might be biased or might not be biased. You can't really tell. Anything could be happening. When we talk about bias and how it's related to the other things, we've kind of already covered it all, but I'll just put it on a single slide so it's easier to follow. Again, bias is a systematic error in assessment results as we're talking about it. And bias and validity are related in that if something is biased, it cannot be valid, right? So if I'm making a systematic error, you can't say that's the truth, which is what validity is, right? So if I have a systematic error, I have bias, I don't have validity. If something is not biased, well, it might be valid, it might not be. It could be unreliable, or it could be very reliable. I could have some content or construct validity issues, or I could have everything in good alignment and measuring the constructs that I want. So I really can't tell if something is not biased whether or not it's valid. Similarly, if something is biased, it might or might not be reliable. I can't really tell. And if something is not biased, it might or might not be reliable, right? So reliability and bias function independently of one another. The only kind of situation in which there might be a relationship is when you have really terrible reliability so that you're all over the place, that you can't really say it's a systematic error. But even then, in many cases, you can find that if it's all those errors aren't kind of centering or averaging out to be the truth, then you would have a bias over or underestimation going on. So those are the relationships between these. There's a short quiz that tests whether or not you can wrap your mind around these things. Feel free to take it twice. You can get the average score, and that'll be that.